ahead.
Okay. And then lastly, the non-petroleum sources, they're forecasted to contribute a bit lower in 22 and then back up in 23. And I'll walk through each of those here on the next slides. So moving on, let's skip slide 11 because I've kind of already gone through that and go to slide 12. And this just compares again the investment revenues, and I did kind of already go through that. Just for those who are watching, this is a presentation that we prepare for the Senate Finance and the House Finance Committees, and so they like for us to break down the different components of the revenue so that they can really discuss them. I think I've already gone through this, so let's move on to the next slide. You know, I talked a lot about how important the investment revenues are to our general fund, but this is a slide that follows on a historical trend basis the revenues or the investments for the permanent fund, the retirement fund, and then other state funds back beginning in 2005. So the navy blue line is the permanent fund, and the gray line is the retirement funds that I'll touch briefly on here. And then lastly, the orange bar, the line there, represents other state funds. And that would be like some of our set-aside funds, our working capital funds, or just general government funds. And in total, these three funds at the end of the year was $123 billion. So that is hugely significant. The permanent fund at 82 billion, like I said, it was a record year, 29.7% return. And what that return did is it generated an additional $291 million of POMV for the 2023 budget. So that is really huge in regard to an increased revenue. The retirement funds also performed exceptionally. The return that we show here is 27.62%, but I know you're going to hear from Kevin Worley next week. He is Department of Administration and Benefits. But there some lagged investment returns have come in since this point in time, such that the retirement funds actually earned 30% as well. And that really puts the retirement system in a really well-funded status. So you may be thinking, okay, so these returns are doing really well. But returns, investment returns are uncertain. I mean, we've seen that in the past month. The market has been volatile. But those who founded these funds were wise in that they built in some conservative controls, if you will, such that the POMV, for example, is calculated using a 5-year smoothing of returns. And so even though 29.7% was earned, only 20% of that comes into the calculation of the POMV. Because, for example, this year, if we do not have, if we don't meet our return goal, you know, we don't want volatility in our revenue sources. And the same thing goes for the retirement funds. We had a fabulous year. And the returns, even though we brought in, you know, just 20% of those returns into the actuarial valuations, it enabled us to reduce the state's contribution to the retirement plans of $179 million in budget savings. So that is hugely significant, and it increased the funding status. So really great news in regard to the investment performance and the impact, the positive impact that it's had on the budget. So moving to the next slide, what we did here was we just provided a graphical representation of the forecasted growth of the percent of market value budget forecast. So you can see, assuming that we achieve a 6.2% long-term annual return on our investments, the POMV continues to grow and continues to be, a significant component of our unrestricted general revenue budget. And due to the way that it's calculated, as I described on the previous slide, it becomes a fairly stable source of revenue because of the use of the 5-year smoothing. And so it's significant to the budget. And so we wanted to present that to you so that you could see how it will grow over time. The next slide is another key investment is, as I mentioned, the retirement system. And I know that Kevin Worley and his team will be discussing this with you next week, but I just wanted to share with you at a very high level the significantly improved funded status of the retirement system. I'm sure that many of you have heard over the years about the large unfunded status of our pension liabilities. And I'm just delighted to share that I think we've turned a corner here and we are making some significant progress in closing this gap. Normally, when you see red on a slide, that is not something good. That usually means it's in the negative. But the way that this slide was prepared is if you look at row F and you look over to the TERS, you'll see a $537,000 amount in red. And what that indicates is that if we were to liquidate the investments as of the end of 21 from the TERS account, we would be overfunded on a fair value basis by $537,000. Now, if I'm going to just really briefly go through the slide, what this represents is pension and healthcare combined, and it shows you a trend from 2019, 20, and 21. And it's differentiated between PERS and TERS. Rows B, C, and D represent the asset value as well as the liability value on an actuarial basis, meaning it's forecast into the future, it includes the smoothing, and you can see how the funded status on an actuarial basis has gone up significantly. So for PERS, it's 85%, and TERS, it's 92%. Now remember, this only included the 20% of that huge return that we had in 21. So then if you look down to row E, F, and G, that's where you can see the numbers on a fair value basis. And if you look at row F and you look at 2021, you can see the unfunded value is $579,000 for PERS, but when you reduce it by $537,000 for TERS, we are underfunded by just $40,000 for both funds, which is huge. Now, we look at it that way, but I just want to emphasize we still manage and invest our funds based on the actuarial approach because we take a conservative approach, and that is the best way to manage the market volatility. And again, the reason I'm bringing this up is because it's very important to our budget, because this generated significant savings in regard to the state's contribution. The next slide is just a depiction of where the primary savings occurred, and that is in the health accounts. And you can see the red in regard to the liability on both, for both PERS and TERS on an actuarial basis, as well as a fair value basis. We are significantly overfunded, which who would have ever guessed we would be in this position today. So, and there, a lot of this is attributable to the excellent work that has been done in the Department of Retirement and Benefits. And I know Emily and Kevin will be talking to you about that next week. We've made changes to healthcare as well as had significant returns. So a great job to them. So moving on to the next slide. This is the first discussion of the taxes and the petroleum revenue. So there are 4 different types of petroleum related taxes. There's a property tax for all the oil and gas property in the state. And you can see it hovers just over $100 million. You know, this is a pretty stable number. But you should note that this represents just the state's share of the petroleum property tax. There's also over an additional $400 million of this that is generated and goes directly to the municipalities or local governments. The state does levy a corporate tax on C corporations doing business in the state, and this is a tax on profits. And so, you know, in fiscal 21, it was a difficult year, and we ended up paying out about $19 million in state refunds. And this was because of a provision of the Federal CARES Act that allows corporations to carry back net operating losses from tax years 2018, 19, and 20. And so what this did was we honored those because we are coupled, if you will, with the IRS regulations. A part of the federal government's goal was to try to get some money circulating back into the economy. So they created this carryback option, and we honored it here as well in our state. The oil and gas production tax is our severance tax on petroleum. And for the North Slope production, this consists of either a net profits tax with a gross minimum tax floor. And at our current prices, just want to point out that we are expecting that we will no longer be in a minimum tax regime throughout the forecast. And we expect to bring in significantly more revenues here. The royalties from oil and gas production on our state lands is the largest source of our unrestricted petroleum revenue, bringing in about $730 million in 2021. And it is forecast to be just around $1 billion in the next couple of years. So moving on to our non-petroleum taxes, you can see here, these are all mostly pretty stable, you know, climbing up some from 2021 to 22 and 23. And as I had mentioned, typically the corporate income tax is the largest of this category, but like I had explained with the petroleum corporate income tax, several of our corporate income tax payers did take advantage of the CARES Act and the ability to offset some of their losses in prior years. Moving on, now I'm going to talk get into some of the detail about the petroleum forecast and go into some of the assumptions. And so let's start out talking about the forecast. So the first thing I wanted to share is I mentioned earlier that we made a decision, a policy decision to change the way we did our oil price and our revenue forecast. And what we used to do in the past is we would use Brent futures market for 2 years, and then we would inflate it just going out into the future. And we did a lot of statistical analysis, and we compared historically the various forecasting options. And our data indicated that using the Brent futures market for as far out as it goes for 8 years was statistically the most accurate. Now, granted, none of them are accurate because they are just forecasts and it is oil price. So we changed our methodology to do that. So what this chart reflects is the black dark line is actual ANS oil price per barrel historically. So you can see the volatility there. And then the dashed black line represents the forecast that the Department of Revenue developed in the fall, in December, actually. The green line on top is the Brent futures forecast as of February 8th. So you can see just in a period of 2 months, the futures market going out into the future is higher, of course, than what we forecast in December. The blue dashed line just represented various analysts at the time, and then the orange line was the EIA. But what we do is we look at various plots of forecasts that we are aware of to make sure that we are among our forecast is reasonable, and so that just provides a little bit of background about how we do our forecast and ensure it's reasonable. So moving on, as I indicated, we recognize that we will likely be wrong in our forecast. So what we do is we create a graphic that will enable folks to calculate what the increased revenues are relative to the increased price of oil. So the blue shaded area represents revenues, our UGF revenues, and across the bottom of the graph represents price. So as you go farther to the right in increased price, you have increasing revenues. And the black line represents the forecast that we selected in the fall. Now, what's important to note is that for every $1 increase in the price of oil, it leads to about a $64 million increase in changed revenue for 2023. In the past, you may recall that number was lower. It was more in the $25 to $35 million range. But as the price of oil goes up and revenues go up, there becomes a turning point in the difference between the profits tax versus paying the minimal tax of 4% for the production tax calculation. Anyways, it's a good chart to reference in the future. So moving on to the next slide, which is slide 22. And this is a slide I'm really excited to share because this is very fresh off our cash flow forecasts that we develop in the Department of Revenue. So I'm going to just give you some background information. Every single month, we develop cash flow forecasts so that we can be on top of the actuals that we have earned to date in regard to revenues, as well as update our outlook for the price of oil. So this helps us to manage our cash flow, to determine the timing of the draws from the permanent fund in regard to the POMV, the 3.1 billion. And it enables us to stay on top of cash flow management. So as we've been looking at these forecasts on a monthly basis, and as the price has been going up very significantly, the amount of surplus that we are anticipating has gone up significantly. And so if you look at the graphic to the right and you look at fiscal year 22, you can see that as of yesterday, we are anticipating a $715 million surplus over the amount of the budget that was approved by the legislature. If you look immediately below that, you can see the outlook for fiscal year 2023. And that surplus amount is estimated now to be $971 million. So it is significant. The price that we used for 2022 is $84.34. And what that represents is actuals through January, and then a forecast from February through June. And so the majority of it is actuals, and then with 5 months of it being a forecast. For fiscal year 2023, the price that we used is $85.44. So it's just up a little bit from fiscal year 22. But as I pointed out, yesterday's ANS price was just under $94 a barrel. And probably what's weighing heavy on everyone's mind, particularly mine, is what will happen to the price of oil if there is a major conflict in Ukraine. And hopefully that does not happen. But I listened to a conversation from a Moody's analyst a couple of days ago, who was indicating they are forecasting WTI, which is typically lower than Brent, to be in the $160 a barrel range. So because the revenues are changing so significantly, we decided here in the Department of Revenue that we wanted to be really transparent with this increased amount of revenues that the state is likely to achieve. And so what we are doing is we are now notifying the legislature as well as the public once a month after we complete these monthly forecasts of a change in revenues if it is plus or minus 10% of the prior notification. So we will be sending out a notification here in the next day or so, notifying the legislature that this is the latest in terms of our forecast. So I just wanted everyone to know on this call that if you are interested in receiving these notifications, you could contact either Genevieve or Leanne at the emails that I put on the slide here, and we will get you on the list and you will be able to receive those notifications along with everyone else. Like I said, our goal is to be really transparent so that, you know, the public, everyone knows what our fiscal status is. Also, in an effort to just be more transparent and enable modeling, if you will, We have also developed an online fiscal modeling tool that looks out into the future for 10 years. And if you haven't already, I would encourage you to get online. It's available on my webpage, on the Commissioner's webpage, as well as in the Tax Division webpage. But you can, as a user of the model, make many different selections. You can select different oil prices. For example, you can select a $60 barrel oil, a $30 barrel oil, a 90, or I think we even went up to a $100 barrel oil. We may have to update that, however. You can select a different percent of market value draw from the permanent fund. You know, most of our assumptions have included up to 5%. But if someone would like to model what it would look like with a 4 or 4.5% draw, you could do that. There's various tax options that we have programmed in. For example, if folks are interested in modeling a sales tax, they can identify certain types of tax bases that would be taxable with various types of sales tax rates. You could model expenditure changes and even go into the level of detail where you increase a department budget or decrease a department's budget. You can model debt. As you change the price of oil, we have it programmed in that the payments associated with our tax certificate credits, they will be adjusted along with the price changes. Anyways, I think you get the point that we built it really robust so that anybody could go in a simple manner, develop what they think would be the appropriate long-term fiscal plan for the state. And to me, that is, you know, it was it's my top priority when I came in as Revenue Commissioner. I really wanted to help with establishing a long-term fiscal plan. So anyways, that is out there and I can't encourage you enough to get out and use it. Moving on to the next slide. Oh, geez, I got to wrap up pretty quick. I have 10 minutes. And the next component of this presentation discusses the production forecast. Juanetta, will you be having the Department of Natural Resources come in and do a separate presentation on that? Because then I won't spend a lot of time on these slides.
We haven't invited them as yet, but either through fiscal policy or energy policy, we will probably be having a production forecast.
Okay.
Session.
Okay, so I'll just touch on the highlights of this. You know, what we're presenting here, what was included in the forecast is the gray line. And we additionally model, there's a high case and a low case in regard to the production forecast that is developed by the Department of Natural Resources. And when they develop the production forecast, I mean, they do quite a statistical analysis and they do a lot of risking and weighting, if you will, of when fields could potentially come online. And, you know, for example, they evaluate the additional drilling that's expected to come on in some of our existing fields, and then they consider the new fields coming online while considering the oil prices, as well as other factors like some of the litigation that is being faced by some of our potentially newer fields, as well as some of the, you know, higher cost of capital that we are seeing as a result of the, you know, anti-Arctic banking initiative that many of the global banks have embarked on. So the high case, the low case is what you see here, and then the official forecast is pretty flat with some increases towards the end of the forecast, mainly due to, Pika and Willow coming online. We can skip the next slide because that just compares it to our spring forecast. And we can go to slide 25. Go back one slide. I think this is pretty interesting because what this does is the gray bars represent the oil and gas employment. The orange line represents the total operating expenses on the in the oil industry, and then the blue line represents the capital. So the solid lines are historical, and then the dotted lines are the forecasts. And just as a point of reference, when we develop these forecasts, we being the Department of Revenue and the Department of Natural Resources, we do sit down with members from the individual oil companies and the explorers and talk to them about their plans. And that is the foundation for these numbers. But what you can see is the labor is very correlated with the capital expenditures as well as the operating expenditures. We see a reduction with the capital expenditures that I think largely follows price, and then you'll also see that with the orange line trend, we are forecasting that many of the reductions that were made in 2021 may become more permanent, if you will. The companies did reduce their costs and likely identified efficiencies through the pandemic. We do show a slow increase, but not as significant as I think in the past. But hopefully with the price of oil going up as high as it has, some other projects may be more economic, and we may see a change in the labor graphs. The next slide is a representation of our transportation costs. And so the blue area represents the marine costs, the cost to take the production from Valdez down to the West Coast. The orange bars represent the tariff associated with getting the oil and the gas down the pipeline. And then the shaded area is what we characterize as other, but that is mostly feeder pipeline tariffs that exist on the North Slope. But here what you can see is, we are forecasting this to be pretty stable into the future, and around just under $10 a barrel. Anyways, I'm going to wrap up now. And I know we don't have a whole lot of time left, but if anyone has any questions, I will do my best to answer them.
Great, thank you, Commissioner. Cheryl, do you want to join in for a quick question?
No, I'll yield to if any of the group has any, but great presentation, Lucinda. Very, very informative. Really appreciate it. But yeah, if others have questions, Juanetta, please let them ask.
All right. And just for the listening audience, again, we will provide a copy of the recording and the commissioner's slide deck along with other reference materials in her presentation in a follow-up email. All of that information is always archived on our website at commonwealthnorth.org under the Fiscal Policy Study Group webpage, and I will be providing that link. Commissioner, one question for you with regard to the visual presentation of state revenues. The picture was total revenues as opposed to spendable operational revenues for any given year. So it's including restricted revenues. Is that correct interpretation of it?
Yeah, the graphic.
Yes.
Yeah, and that was total revenues, federal, restricted, it was everything.
So on a typical year, our total state spend would be more in line with 60% federal revenues and 40% state revenues from all sources.
Whatever I think what we're looking at for 2023 is probably typical, and I don't have those percentages calculated, but that sounds, I'd have to just calculate the numbers.
Sure. We have a question from Dan Sadler, and he's asking on slide 15 if you could explain the difference between fair value and actuarial value because of the significant effect that has on overall.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that is something that Kevin Worley will discuss more with you next week. But the actuarial value is the value of the assets smoothed over 5 years. And so as I was sharing with you, the fund had a significant year for 2021, and the fair value of the assets, for example, if you look at slide 15, you can see for PERS, the fair value of the asset was 21.7 billion. But if you look up to row B, you can see the actuarial value was 19 billion. So it's significantly less. And the reason is due to trying to manage market volatility. So the actuarial value only included 20% of the upside of the increased asset value due to the return environment, whereas the fair value considered the entire amount. And when I think of fair value, I think of it as if we were going to liquidate the portfolio today in an orderly manner, would the value of those assets be sufficient to cover the liabilities? And on a fair value basis for PERS, you could see the answer is we're within $579,000 of being able to do that, which is pretty significant.
Okay.
Did that answer your question, Dan? Okay, great.
Thanks. All right. Commissioner, when you were during your presentation, I kept reflecting back on a comment by labor economist Neil Fried some years ago, reflecting on the Alaska economy, the Alaska situation, is that it seems like it takes a disaster for there to be any significant heat in the Alaska economy. And it seems like as you walk through your presentation in terms of the changing condition with regard to the pension funds, changing condition with regard to revenues, certainly changing condition with regard to oil prices, that truism is being borne out again. Neil was reflecting back on the fact that our state was in a pretty tenuous position before the 1964 earthquake, and that there was a tremendous amount of heat that resulted with economic recovery from the earthquake. And then he remarked that really the next time that you saw, even with oil, that the next time that there was anything after oil was with the oil spill. And so that we just have this disproportionate benefit from disasters. And I'm just wondering if maybe you could reflect on that. If we move into some period of normalcy, we have to return to struggling with some of our structural challenges with our budget.
Well, my comment on that is, in terms of long-term fiscal planning, the goal to me is to try to establish as much certainty as possible. And so we've done that with the POMV. I mean, that is, I think, a pretty stable revenue source. The price of oil, we can't control that. That's a function of global markets. But what we can control is how we spend. And so to the extent that we can put a cap on spending such that when we have boom periods like we're experiencing now with the price of oil going up, to the extent that we can take that surplus and, start, replenishing some of our reserves and having it available then to enable us to get through some of the more challenging times, that's how we get through this. And, I've looked at charts that go way back in time, back 20 years, and I look at how much money we spent as a state when the price of oil was so high. And I'm just hopeful that that doesn't happen again, that, with these high oil price environments, we stay disciplined, we keep a tough hold on spending so that when we go through the busts, we're just better prepared.
All right, thank you for that. Well, I'm going to put out one final call to the audience for any additional questions. You can also turn on your camera if you'd like to ask a question, and I will call on you. But again, caution you to ask a question pertinent to the topic that we've asked the commissioner to speak to today. Commissioner, I'll throw in another quick question. Commonwealth North has, a small fund invested, and we have been advised by our investment advisors, that for this current year, that the spendable amount of our fund is 4.25 in comparison to 5% that we've been calculating our annual allowable spend on. Any reflections on that? Any thoughts on that? Even at 5%, are we perhaps edging against even the theory, the foundations of percent of market value spending?
Yeah, we've looked at that and reviewed that with the Board of Trustees. I'm a member of the Permanent Fund Board of Trustees, and evaluated 5%. And 5% is a fair number when we compare ourselves to other endowments or sovereign wealth funds. But the other thing to think about is the actual effective rate of the draw. So even though, it's 5%, it's smoothed over a period of years. And so the effective rate is really lower because of the way that the smoothing process works. But I know it is a point of discussion. I know that there are some in the legislature that, think 5% is too high, and, that the number should be lower. We'll just have to see what happens with the environment. But it is a best practice when we compare to other funds.
Great, thank you. We do have another question from Dan Sadler. He's asking, what was the reasoning for the significant change in the mining license tax revenue noted on slide 18?
Yeah, geez, I should know that. I think Colleen is online, but I think I would prefer to get back with you on that, Dan. I think that some of the commodity prices have gone up, but I would like to have that factual, and I'll send you all a note.
Great, thanks. I'll share that with the audience if you send it my way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. Okay, well, we're a little past 1 o'clock. I'm sure you probably got lots of other meetings to go on to.
Yeah.
So we appreciate your time today. I think Cheryl has had to exit for another meeting as well. So on her behalf and on behalf of Commonwealth North, thank you, Commissioner. We appreciate the presentation, the information. We'll be sharing it with the audience for future reference, and wish you good luck as the legislative session proceeds and all the good questions come your way.
Yeah, and I just want to close with, if anyone's listening and they have questions, send them our way. Our goal is to provide as much information as we can to the public. So you just get them my way, I'll get them answered, and we'll get you a response.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a great day.